I currently have 3 Chase Freedom Flexes, but there's a reason I don't have 4. And by the end of this video, you'll know exactly why it's worth it to have at least one Chase Freedom always in your wallet setup, and if you have more than one, why you could be looking at earning not just hundreds, but thousands of dollars of value in the long term. The first Chase Freedom Flex I got wasn't by me applying as a new applicant. It was actually a product which existed known as the Chase Freedom, and due to a refresh of this product was when and how it became the Chase Freedom Flex. The superpower of the Freedom Card is the fact that it gives us 5% back on specific rotating categories each and every quarter, year over year. In English, this means if there's a category such as gas stations or dining or specific merchants like Amazon.com, we'd be getting 5% with those merchants/categories up to $1,500 in spend each quarter. And aside from this, it'd be 1x everywhere else. And today, what the Freedom Flex offers us is the following. For new card members, we're looking at a sign-up bonus of $200 back after $500 in a minimum spend in the first 3 months. This card has no annual fee, and a secondary part of this intro offer is the fact that you get 0% intro APR on both purchases and balance transfers. In terms of earning structure, this is what it looks like. We get 5% back on bookings made through Chase's internal travel portal, whether you're booking rental cars, hotels, or flight. Apart from this, we're also getting 3% back on each and every dollar spent, whether it's in the restaurant or for takeout eligible delivery services. We also get 3% on drugstore purchases and 1% everywhere else. This card's advertised as a cashback earning card, but the fact is we actually get these points deposited into our account in the form of Chase Ultimate Reward Point. These points can be redeemed at 1 penny per point, so in other words, 5% worth of points when we get that cash back can be redeemed for exactly that amount, but depending on how you redeem these points, you could get a lot more value. When it comes to the 5% earning categories with the Chase Freedom Flex, it's pretty interesting because you don't really get 5% per dollar on that category. You actually get 4 additional points when you spend with that category. What this means is, let's say we have 3% back on dining with the Chase Freedom Flex, which is always the case regardless of any rotational category. And now let's say we're in a quarter where the category happens to be restaurants/dining. Now we'll get 3x, just base rate, and we'll get 4 more points per dollar spent on that category. So in total, we'd be earning 7x instead of just 5x. And to bring the point home, let's say we hit that cap of $1,500 in a quarter, then we go back to the base rate. So in terms of dining, it'd be back to 3%. If it's some non-categorical spend, then we're going back to 1% per dollar spent. Essentially, I got my first Freedom Flex not by putting a new application, but by executing upon something known as a product change. The process was very straightforward. It was me just calling Chase. There was no hard inquiry or otherwise. It's literally just changing over my Chase Freedom product into the Freedom Flex. There are definitely some limitations when it comes to product changes, and it's going to depend on the bank/issuers for very specific rules. Yet when it comes to the Freedom Flex and Chase's scenario, I'll give a quick example. When it comes to Chase, the flagship cards, they're typically known as to be the Chase Freedom Unlimited, the Chase Freedom Flex, the Chase Sapphire Preferred, the Chase Sapphire Reserve, and then a whole slew of business cards. When you have a personal card like the ones I mentioned versus a Chase business card, the understanding is that you're not going to be able to product change between the personal line of cards and the business cards, and vice versa. Similarly, when it comes to Chase's co-brand cards, where you have more hotel card offerings and airline card offerings such as Hyatt, Marriott, IHG. On the airline side, you have a slew of airlines, a few examples being Southwest, Iberia Air, British Airways, Aer Lingus, etc. When it comes to these co-brand cards, it's understood that you're not going to be able to product change these cards to the Chase flagship cards or vice versa. With this context, this is how I got my second Chase Freedom Flex. There's another Chase flagship card known as a Chase Freedom Unlimited. And it's a great card. It gets you 1.5% cash back on each and every purchase, as well as very similar earning rate to the Chase Freedom Flex. The point here is that the Chase Freedom Unlimited, the power it has is that 1.5% back per dollar spent. So in other words, instead of just 1% everywhere, you'd be getting that extra 0.5% guaranteed. When I did have it, it was my catch-all category card, and it was awesome. Yet, fast forward, when I saw the value of what I could reap from the Chase Freedom Flex, I really thought, do I really want to keep this Freedom Unlimited, or do I want to earn 5% back on the same categories I may or may not spend on, but have the ability to when I really want to max out that category? It pretty much mathematically made sense to go with the Chase Freedom Flex. The simple math behind this is that if you have 5% up to $1,500 in spend, just in pure cash back, you're looking at $75 a quarter. 75 times 4 is $300 back. That's with the assumption that you're maxing out these categories. In other words, $6,000 worth of spend each year. The super simple mathematical way I justified this was the sheer fact that that extra 0.5% back you're getting on each and every purchase with the Chase Freedom Unlimited, really you're getting, in theory, 4 times more points with the Chase Freedom Flex. So instead of a 0.5% back on each and every category, if there was a category with the Chase Freedom Flex, it's like I'm getting 8 times more value back. So if there's a category such as home improvement stores, for example with Lowe's or Home Depot, which are part of the Chase Freedom Flex's category offering, then typically speaking, if I'm not getting more than, let's say, 1% or 1.5% back on each and every dollar spent with them, but I'm able to get literally 5%, then it's almost like a no-brainer. It's easy to get really hyper optimized on the math and the calculations with this example, but without getting too much into the nitty-gritty, let's move on to how I got my third Chase Freedom Flex. The third one was a very interesting situation. It was when Chase introduced this rule called the one sapphire rule. There are 2 sapphire offerings on the personal Chase card side, known as the Chase Sapphire Preferred and the Chase Sapphire Reserve. Essentially, you could have one or the other. When this rule came out, I already had the Chase Sapphire Reserve and the Preferred at the same time. The understanding was that, hey, in the future, if you already have one of these cards, you can only have one, you can't have both at the same time. When it comes to the Chase Sapphire Preferred versus the Reserve, I made a recent video here on the channel, I'll link here, yet the headline for our discussion here today is the fact that holding both really doesn't make a lot of logical sense or even financial sense, except for in some very hyper-specific niche use cases. With that understanding, I basically was like, all right, I'm going to keep the Reserve, let me do away with the Preferred, but instead of canceling it, naturally I had the option of product changing it once more. When it comes to no annual fee cards, that product change terminology makes sense. You're just changing from one to another. So both the Freedom and the Freedom Flex, as well as the Freedom Unlimited, have no annual fee. But with the Preferred and the Reserve, they do have annual fees. With that understanding, the huge call out here is that there's something known as the Card Act, where when you get a card in the first year, that bank/issuer cannot raise your annual fee. What this meant was, let's say we got the Chase Freedom Flex today and we want to upgrade to the Chase Sapphire Preferred on day 2 or day 364. So still within that 1 year. The fact is, you would go from a no annual fee to having an annual fee. The point here was that I already had the Sapphire Preferred, so I wasn't really upgrading, I was actually downgrading. The fact is, it's still a product change. It's just a terminology being slightly different. With that case, I basically downgraded to another Freedom Flex, which is how I got 3 total. Frankly speaking, if we know that one Freedom Flex makes sense financially for basically anybody because it has no annual fee and it only has quote unquote upside, then having 2 or 3 or using that scalable kind of common sense in this case, if one works and there's no downside, then infinity should work as well. The question comes back, if you ask me, if you have 3 and you have the option to get 4, then why don't you have 4? There's a truth and a lie, and the truth is, other than me being over 524, which is Chase's hard rule of, hey, if you open 5 or more accounts over the last 24 months, then in theory, you're basically auto-denied. So in other words, if I applied for the Chase Freedom Flex today, perfect credit score, perfect everything, right? I would still be, in theory, denied. The caveat here is that I currently have 3 Chase Freedom Flexes and a Chase Sapphire Reserve. The Chase Sapphire Reserve, similar to the Preferred, I could also downgrade and get a 4th Freedom Flex. To be super honest, the value of having 4 Chase Freedom Flexes versus 3 Chase Freedom Flexes and 1 Chase Sapphire Reserve, I feel that second option is what I would 99 out of 100 times always pick and choose. The interesting thing here is that there's a competitor card to the Chase Freedom Flex known as the Discover It Cashback card, which also has 5% rotating categories. I bring this up because the Discover It, its cashback calendar of what categories earn that 5%, it's released at the beginning of each and every year. On the flip side with Chase, it's pretty much announced more closer to that next quarter. If I could plan for each and every quarter, whether that's 1 full year or even further out, then I could definitely just track, okay, hey, what is the cash flow in? What makes sense to spend? Does it make sense to spend in a certain category to max it out if it makes sense for the bigger picture? Or am I already organically spending naturally in a category where it makes more sense for me to have that much of expenditure in 1 quarter for a certain category where it makes sense to have, let's say, 4 Chase Freedom Flexes instead of just this 3 and 1 Chase Sapphire Reserve Reserve combo. In simple words, if you have 3 Chase Freedom Flexes with that $1,500 cap each quarter, you're looking at $4,500 of spend in a certain quarter. And if you have 4 Chase Freedom Flexes, you're looking at $6,000. At the time of recording, I'm nowhere near maxing out that $4,500 per category per quarter. And so having 4 really wouldn't logically make sense. And in that case, if it does for you, it definitely could. That's one angle. And the fact is, I get way too much value from the Chase Sapphire Reserve, hands down. And I really don't know when I would ever make it a 4th Freedom Flex unless I knew there was that much expense where it just made sense to earn more points through that type of expenditure versus holding on to my Chase Sapphire Reserve. Some people hate the Chase Sapphire Reserve, some people love it. In my case, I've had it since the very first day it came out 7+ years ago. To see my thoughts, to see what value I'm actually getting from it, click over here. I'll see you there.